Ele deu um sinal agora.
Ok. Posso começar?
Sim, ele está fazendo lá e vai apertar um botão e vai aparecer lá no YouTube. Por enquanto está aparecendo só o logotipo.
Tá bom. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the seminar. It's a great pleasure to host this event. I'm André Bretanão, professor of sociology here. First, this is the first seminar jointly organized by the Departments of Political Science, Sociology, and the Center for Metropolitan Studies. I sincerely hope this will not be the last one. I really like this idea of bringing different disciplinary approaches to discuss shared themes such as cities, inequalities, governance, and so on. I'm also delighted that we are joined today by Professor Benjamin Bradlow from Princeton University, who will present and discuss his outstanding book, Urban Power, which I think you agree it's a work of great relevance to our fields. For those who may not know him, Benjamin Bradlow is an assistant professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton University. He's also a visiting researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and a CIFAR, is it CIFAR? How do you CIFAR, sorry. CIFAR Azrieli Global Scholar. His work explores the intersections of climate change, urbanization, technological transformation, and the political challenges facing democracies worldwide. He's currently working on his next book project, The Climate Hinge, Green Industrial Transitions in the Global South. And today we're discussing this, his 2024 book, Urban Power. The seminar will proceed as follows. Professor Bradlow will present his book for half an hour, followed by a commentary from Professor Eduardo Marques. We'll then open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. For those watching on YouTube, maybe I say this in Portuguese now. Para aqueles que estão nos acompanhando pelo YouTube, vocês podem escrever suas perguntas no chat e a gente vai monitorar. Bom dizer também, se alguém se sentir mais confortável de fazer perguntas para Ben em português, a gente pode fazer essa tradução. Ok. Bom, obrigado. Thank you.
Can I use this?
Sure.
Ok. Vou falar em inglês hoje só para que seja mais preciso com minhas palavras. Mas durante a sessão das perguntas, por favor, se você quiser, use o português. So it's a great honor to be able to present this work to colleagues here at USP. I was hosted by Edu and the Centro de Estudos da Metrópole in 2016 and 2017 when I was doing research for this book. And I think you'll see the influence of faculty, postdocs, and graduate students here at SEM and at USP all over this work. This talk draws from my book called Urban Power, which was published in October by Princeton University Press. And what I'm going to do today is draw from my field-based research in Johannesburg and São Paulo to argue for a set of conceptual tools to explain why some cities are more effective than others in reducing inequality. So two of the cities that are responsible for the contemporary global explosion of city growth are Johannesburg and São Paulo. Each of these cities are predicted to be among a group of 41 so-called megacities, defined as being home to at least 10 million people in the next 10 years. And today, both Brazil and South Africa rank in the top 10 of the World Bank's calculations of international Gini coefficients, which measures inequalities of income. And residential and formal settlements are the quintessential image of this inequality. So I'll show you today that while both cities are clearly very unequal and have both pursued policies to reduce inequality, they're not equally unequal. And this is particularly so in the provision of public goods, often by local government. So my book focuses on the distribution of public goods of housing, transportation, public collective transportation, and residential sanitation For today, I'm going to focus on housing, and to the extent I bring in sanitation, it will be through the lens of housing and land use law. So each city has generated policies that are intended to reduce what are conceived as backlogs of housing demand, but they've done so in very different ways. So government-subsidized housing projects in Johannesburg are delivered exclusively in the existing peripheries where apartheid once designated black-only townships. These projects are all on undeveloped so-called greenfield land, and residents of informal settlements are subject to frequent evictions from both local government and private landowners. In contrast, in São Paulo, I'll describe a set of new policy tools that the city has used, and I'll just note that this study ends in 2016, which might affect how you view some of these results. I'll describe a set of new tools that the city has used to reserve land for housing projects outside of the market, as well as to upgrade existing informal settlements where they are, what planners and architects call in situ upgrading. And as a result, the city ended communal evictions by local government. So the effects of these policies have also changed conditions within informal settlements because the provision of services like sanitation largely depends on land use law. So I took these statistics from the first census after transitions to democracy in both countries and the last census in this period of study. Both cities have had informal settlement populations between 10 and 15% throughout this period, but the quality of life in these areas has diverged significantly. So in Johannesburg, the share of households in informal settlements with a toilet was 36% in '96, rising slightly to 47% by 2011. And here you see basically indeterminate change across the three census waves that are depicted in the maps here. In São Paulo, the share of households in informal settlements with a toilet was actually lower than Johannesburg at 25% in '91, but it almost tripled by 2011 to 68%. And here you can see a more linear darkening of these maps, which reflects that increased coverage of toilets inside households in an informal settlement. So compared to Johannesburg, São Paulo clearly is a positive case, and there's also substantial literature among Brazilian researchers that's shown that improvements in São Paulo are particularly notable among a highly variable range of cities, even within Brazil. So this divergence between Johannesburg and São Paulo suggests an empirical puzzle. Why are some cities more effective than others in reducing inequality? Today I want to share with you how the combination of two factors explain why governing regimes in cities are or are not able to realize a more equal distribution of urban public goods. First, a local state that is embedded in civil society, and in particular I'm going to talk about a sphere of housing movements in civil society. And second, an institutional sphere of the local state that is cohesive. Now, I'll define these in more depth in a moment, but before I do, I want to explain why I chose these cases in the first place. So there were three components to the social basis for the struggle for democracy in both countries: a new independent trade union federation, neighborhood and citywide social movements focused on housing and basic services, and a political party of the left. And this kind of alliance has been described in political sociology as a social movement unionist alliance. Now, Brazil and South Africa are new democracies. In relatively older democracies like the US, it's still kind of a democracy for now. Constitutions are exclusively focused on civil and political rights, but the social movement unionist alliance in both Brazil and South Africa was heavily involved in negotiations over new constitutions. And it's no accident that these constitutions ended up with significant social and economic rights. So first, you see new rights to housing, sanitation, and transportation in both constitutions. You also see provision for decentralized fiscal transfers and implementing authority that's allocated to local government. So this means that local government has both the fiscal capacity and the legal power to make it a meaningful place to analyze how well it changes the distribution of public goods. So in comparison, in the US, the municipal tier does not exist in the Constitution. So all of this led me to focus on the politics of local government in order to make sense of conflict over distributing these public goods. So what are ways to think about what we should expect to happen in these cases? The urban literature in sociology tends to assume that the political story is driven by globalization and neoliberalism, or that it's driven by the programmatic orientation of local property elites towards economic growth. A power resources literature in political sociology that's more traditionally focused on the politics of distribution. And this is largely a literature about social democracy at the national level. It's focused on the role of democracy in empowering coalitions of working class movements and political parties of the left, as well as the internal organization of working class movements as determinants of redistributive success. So while the urban literature would predict deepening, what's going on here? How do I get back here? There we go, I think. The urban literature would predict deepening inequalities in both cases. The social movement unionist histories of both countries would predict reduced inequalities in these cases. So these are theories of macro level structure or of how social forces align to produce governing regimes aimed at changing inequality. But what's missing is an institutional level that can help us to understand a more variation-finding approach to comparison across these cities, particularly when I've just shown you that the empirical outcomes don't align neatly with either of these expectations in the literature. So in the book, I focus on the policy arenas of housing, sanitation, and collective transportation. I pursued this, the data collection through fieldwork between 2015 and 18 in both cities, including 225 semi-structured interviews with all of the key actors in the public, private, and civil society space who were involved in conflicts over policy for each of these three arenas. And I augmented those interviews with archival research and policy documents, news, media, trade publications, NGO publications, et cetera. So after my research in the field, I found that two factors explain when and why the local state is capable of changing the distribution of public goods in the city. The first is a local state that is embedded in civil society, and I define embeddedness as the ties of the local state to civil society that produce the ideas and space within bureaucratic agencies for redistributive policy change. So to illustrate, I was looking for things like, do mid-level bureaucrats regularly interact with movements demanding things that they're supposed to be working on? Are there movements working within the bureaucracy itself? And then second, cohesive institutions. And I define cohesion as the coordinating capacity of the local state to implement policy changes. And this is not just a general form of what often gets grouped under the category of state capacity. Municipal government is distinctive because it's a delegated scale that's regulated through a national institutional framework. So cohesion captures distinct dimensions of coordinating delegated authority. We can think of two such dimensions: a horizontal dimension coordinating across line agencies within local government, and a vertical dimension coordinating across scales of government: local, provincial or state, national or federal government. So this is how we can think about the argument in a cross-sectional 2x2 table. And remember, these configurations explain the institutional reforms that correlate to material outcomes in the distribution of public goods. So when we have low embeddedness and low cohesion, I call this a rentier regime characterized by narrow elite capture. When we have high embeddedness and low cohesion, I call this a mobilizational regime characterized by policies targeting redistribution but lacking financial and administrative capacity. We have low embeddedness and high cohesion. I call this a managerial regime characterized by programmatic top-down administration generally oriented narrowly towards economic growth. And then this elusive configuration of high embeddedness and high cohesion, what I call an integrationist regime, where we have effective administration of policies targeting redistribution. And I want to underscore that in theory, no city is immutably in one of these ideal types. And part of my task here is to show why time and sequence are critical for understanding why cities are characterized by high or low embeddedness or cohesion at different points in time. So I want to move into the cases, and one thing that I'm going to do is show how sequence matters for where each of these two cities ends up. As we'll see, both cities start their democratic periods in what looks like a mobilizational configuration of high embeddedness and low cohesion. But Johannesburg moves from this to a rentier configuration of low embeddedness and low cohesion. And this outcome is particularly surprising because in many ways, the anti-apartheid movement in Johannesburg was much more powerful than its analogous movement in São Paulo. The movement for black political liberation and democracy made housing and urban land a core mobilizing issue. After democratization in '94, the explicit priority of the African National Congress government was to use housing and land use policy to, quote, de-racialize the city. And so while legacies of apartheid were likely to be strong, this is a case where we have strong mobilization that combines race and class along with a dominant party alignment across local, provincial, and national government. And as we know, the PT never won power at the state level in São Paulo. So to set the stage, in Johannesburg, housing movements and neighborhood associations allied to an independent trade union federation united under the banner of the United Democratic Front, or UDF, in the 1980s. And this is a poster from a rally that the UDF held in Johannesburg's Soweto Township in 1983. At this rally, they were protesting what were then called community councils. These were unelected local authorities whose intentionally poor delivery outcomes produced one of the central demands of the UDF during the negotiations over the transition to democracy in '94, summed up in the slogan, "One city with one tax base." And the idea of this demand was that in order to overcome the divides of apartheid, urban development, richer white areas would cross-subsidize poorer black areas through a central municipal property tax collection. So what you're looking at here is an official map of the municipal governing arrangement that actually came out of the negotiations for a new municipal structure. And it's a bit confusing and fractured, and that's precisely the point. A critical compromise in the rushed negotiations before the first elections nationally in '94 led to the institution of what were called 4 municipal substructures that had strong powers, including the power to collect property taxes, which they were then supposed to hand over to a central fiscus. The African National Congress government, the government of Nelson Mandela, takes an explicit decision that its social movement allies should demobilize in order to not interfere with the capacity of government to implement. So for movements in the black townships, the historic social base of the ANC government, this was seen as a betrayal. Not only did municipal substructures have powers of tax collection, but they also had a proportional vote in the city council. So the central city authority, which was now led by politicians who came from the civic movements in Soweto, moved quickly to make new capital investments in housing and basic infrastructure. But this would become vulnerable to relatively hidden strategies of traditional white elites who could not directly challenge the political legitimacy of these investments. And one of the key civic movement leaders who ended up as a city councilor in this period described this sense of betrayal. In an interview, he said, they, referring to the ANC, gave more power to the white section of the city by making it proportional rather than based on an open vote where it's obvious we would have swamped them. The power of municipal substructures became an attractive mechanism for traditional white elites, both property owners and property developers, groups that don't always see eye to eye. They could not directly attack the legitimacy of redistributive policies of the central city government, which focused on investments in housing and basic infrastructure in the black townships. The role of racialization was particularly important for emphasizing the legitimacy of the new government. A black majority had extremely high political legitimacy. So traditional white elites pursued a more hidden route to undermine the capacity to actually implement these policies. They pursued a strategy of ring-fencing property tax contributions to the sub-municipal level through what were called city improvement districts. These also exist in many cities in the US and in other parts of the world. One of the early examples of these city improvement districts was in the neighborhood of Santon, pictured here, which is often described in promotional documents of both the private and public sector as, quote, Africa's richest square mile. So the founder of this first city improvement district was extremely honest with me when I interviewed her about what the point of this strategy was. She said, we definitely weren't going to give our tax contributions to the city because there would be no guarantee that it would be spent in the area, referring to her neighborhood. So we did a deal, and she went on to describe a very close relationship with officials at the sub-municipal level that enabled this to happen. So there were two key factors in this strategy that left the previously embedded local state increasingly without ties to civil society to effectively countervail the power of traditional white elites. First, you have the demobilization of largely black housing movements in the townships, the rush to complete a negotiated democratic transition in '94 was coupled with an increasingly open ideological position of the ANC that the newly black-led government would be charged with undoing the legacies of apartheid without a social partner. This was coupled with an explicit insistence on the demobilization of movements that had previously developed strong capacities to challenge government and hold it to account. And then secondly, we see how traditional white elites pursue strategies to disable the capacity of the ANC government in Johannesburg to finance and deliver on its redistribution-oriented goals. So I've described so far how Johannesburg's lack of embeddedness helped produce low horizontal cohesion, that is the capacity to coordinate within the local government bureaucracy. But we can also see how it didn't develop vertical cohesion. In housing and land use, the first reason for this is that national housing policy was to invest in subsidized housing production to be managed by provincial rather than local governments. And this helped create an incentive to develop low-income housing in the cheapest areas of the city, reproducing the traditional poor and black peripheries of the city. And this is an example of one such housing development in the far southern periphery of Johannesburg. Despite this, the city tried to rein in private property developers who themselves were creating a new type of wealthy periphery in the northern parts of the city, further and further away from the sprawling black townships of the south. And the city did so by instituting what it called an urban development boundary. The idea was to prevent private development that would strain the financial resources of the city to provide bulk infrastructure like roads and sewers to these new wealthy developments. But developers learned to venue shop for building permits by approaching provincial government as opposed to municipal government. And this allowed them to violate the city's urban development boundary. So I still remember sitting in the office of this longtime bureaucrat in land use management of the city. She was surrounded by piles of permits that she was unable to deal with. And she had a very audible sigh of frustration. She said, these guys, they saw a loophole, and then most applications were processed by province. Now they had powers to disregard any of our policies. So in 2010, the municipality of Johannesburg won a constitutional court case, that's the highest court, against the Gauteng province, that its boundary should be respected. But challenges by the main organization of property owners and developers in the city meant that key provisions of this court decision have yet to be implemented almost 15 years later. So in sum, in Johannesburg, we see weakening political and social support from local governments' base and movements to countervail the structural power of traditional white elites. These white elites organize and strategize around the color line to pursue hidden strategies to undermine redistribution-oriented reforms. And in a recent paper, I refer to these as weapons of the strong. And the result is a city government without capacity to regulate land in such a way that it can achieve its redistributive goals, as ambitious as spatial transformation, deracializing the city, or even the more simple task of enforcing an urban boundary. So this is how we can see Johannesburg moving through this conceptual 2x2 that I presented earlier. And now I want to move to São Paulo. And to preview the case, we see a similar starting point to Johannesburg. High embeddedness of the local state with housing movements produces a raft of new investments in housing, especially through the upgrading of informal settlements. But unlike Johannesburg, after reaction by traditional elites, a more resilient set of movements keeps the local state embedded and in turn builds increasing bureaucratic cohesion to deliver. So we see a sequence where a mobilizational regime transforms into something that, compared to Johannesburg's, looks like more of an integrationist regime. So the first mayoral term of the Workers' Party was led by Mayor Luisa Erundina. She promised an inversion of priorities in the city's budget to establish what was referred to, I think it's sometimes even still referred to, as a PT way of governing. During this period, we see the beginning of embedded ties that would become durable across governing regimes. And in order for that to happen, Erundina's administration had to create the space for movements to enter the bureaucratic sphere in local government. And this was uncomfortable even for a housing secretary like Herminia Maricatu, who was at that time was already well known in the city as an advocate for poor people's housing. And when I spoke with her, she had something between a knowing wink and an exasperated eye roll recalling this period. She said, in that period, social movements would occupy our offices 1 week on, 1 week off. They always wanted to speak with us. My life wasn't easy because they were placing constant demands on our office. So that's the voice of the highest ranking housing official in the city. But the numbers of street-level bureaucrats doubled in the housing department under Erundina from 350 to 700, and the approach to administration was distributed across the geography of the city, including in the far peripheries that are home to most of Sao Paulo's informal settlements. So these projects primarily focused on self-build housing projects called mutirão, through which the city was able to begin extending sanitation services as well. And on your left is a picture of one of the first of these projects. These types of projects relied on coordination between city officials and housing movements, which enabled an approach that urban planners called in situ upgrading. This kind of complex form of informal settlement upgrading, where people live, requires close interaction between residents and officials, as complications like a temporary relocation in order to complete a sewer pipe require high degrees of trust and expectation of follow-through. So one of these street-level bureaucrats during this period, who actually rose to become quite a senior official in housing in Sao Paulo much later, described what he saw as the key nature of working during this period. The difference, I think, was the capillary nature of policy. You had technical officials in different parts of the city who worked directly with the people. The people were their primary reference point, and they were always near a housing project. This was the embryo of what we called local government. So the lack of cohesion in both the horizontal financial dimension as well as the vertical interscalar dimension opened the doors for reaction. Erundina, the PT, did not win re-election in '92, and this was followed by right-wing governments that canceled the self-build mutirão programs and increased evictions of people living in informal settlements. And one of the leaders of one of the older generations of housing movements in the city described an almost warlike footing for housing movements during that period. From the beginning of '93 until the last mobilization before municipal elections in 2000, the response from government was against us. They began an attack on the housing movements. But housing movements in the peripheries had not been demobilized, and they were energized to both fight for the reinstatement of programs that they had won under Erundina and to fight the growing frequency of evictions. So by 2000, they were a core bloc that helped bring the PT back to power in the city. So my informants in Sao Paulo local government kept suggesting that something had changed to make their work more effective beginning in the 2000s, beyond just the return of the PT to the mayoral seat. And it turned out that the federal government had developed policy instruments that could help cities to integrate line agencies, especially planning, housing, and sanitation. These laws emerged from demands that had first been made by housing movements in the 90s. So the Federal City Statute of 2001 established a legal framework for Sao Paulo's first master plan during the democratic era, which was the first of any major city in the country. And this plan designated ZEIS, zones of special social interest, which made it possible to upgrade informal settlements without finalizing individual land title. This municipal innovation drew on the federal constitution's provision for a social function of property and amounted to an assertion of the public right to relativize private property. A participatory municipal housing council established in 2002 under the same city statute provided a forum for joint deliberation between different social sectors of society on key urban policy priorities. And the longtime representative of SECOVI, the Sao Paulo Chamber of Real Estate in the city, described to me a major shift in how the real estate sector had to do business during, in these new deliberative spaces like the Municipal Housing Council. He said to me, we can't enter this game thinking that we're going to get everything that we want. The master plan, for it to be good for our city, it should mediate and perceive what's relevant from society's point of view and what is the public's interest. So I might see some eyes rolling here. And I don't want to be too Pollyanna-ish in interpreting this quote.
We are broadcasting this.
Yeah.
You should be careful.
Yeah, it's okay. He's not watching. He's speaking to a foreign researcher and he wants to give an agreeable spin. But this was very different from the kind of talk that I heard from similarly positioned people in the property sector in Johannesburg, who were extremely dismissive of both grassroots activists and government planning efforts altogether. And further, in Johannesburg, they tended to present their interests as equivalent to the public interest. So many of the personnel from the Erundina era persisted within the bureaucracy and spread out not only in the housing department, but also in planning, land use, and sanitation, all of which are located in this Martinelli building, which I know some of you have worked in. And we might think of this building as having become a physical representation of this horizontal cohesion. The proliferation of these bureaucrats with ties to housing movements across departments in the building created a more networked set of ties across key departments for coordinating residential and formal settlement upgrading. And this circulation of bureaucrats has been confirmed by network analyses of municipal officials conducted by a group of Brazil-based researchers, including Edu. So this is a key form of horizontal cohesion that I find is precipitated through embeddedness. Federal law continued to empower Sao Paulo's local government, what I call vertical cohesion. So the passage of the National Sanitation Law in 2007 empowered city governments to ensure that sanitation companies responded to municipal priorities. And officials in both Sabesp and the Municipal Sanitation Department reported to me that increased regulatory power for the municipality enabled better integration of these priorities into the state company's plans. And this is a photo of the Guarapiranga Reserve in the south of the city, which is one of the most difficult areas of the city to service with sanitation. For 30 years, it's been a major area of concern due to problems of water pollution and flood risk. But after the passage of the National Sanitation Law, a center-right local administration made its upgrading a priority. And it was able to do so in part through the flexible application of the ZEIS provision from the master plan. So Betsy França, the housing secretary from 2005 to 2012, I see she's now been appointed again as a secretary in the municipality. She described to me the pressure that pushed her office to develop the capacity to make the Guarapiranga settlements more resilient. She said, in Sao Paulo, we have serious movements, and they have histories and representativity, and they should exist, no? They're always there fighting, and public authorities are sometimes struggling to keep up with them. Now, many of the movements that I spoke with named Betsy França by name as an enemy because she was in a center-right administration. But the outcomes in the interview data indicate a more institutionalized setting for co-producing improved neighborhood infrastructure by integrating social movements into policy and administration. So this is a period where embeddedness of the local state in a sphere of housing movements went hand in hand in pushing even center-right governments to maintain a project of cohesive institution building to deliver. And I'm not going to talk about it too much right now, but I actually see the Haddad administration in the city as the moment where this began to fall apart. So we can talk about that in the Q&A. So in São Paulo, we see continued mobilization of a social movement base as a countervailing force. Traditional elites are forced to reckon with a more redistributive vision of the city, and we see increased local capacity to finance and plan for redistribution. So this is a study of two cities that go through a particular sequence of configurations of embeddedness and cohesion. And in relative terms, we can see how these two cities have traveled through the conceptual space that I presented today. But before I end, I want to return to a global picture. I began by asking, why are some cities more effective than others in reducing inequalities? It's about both the ties of the local state to civil society and the internal dynamics of coordinating local state action. And I'm suggesting that embeddedness does not necessarily undercut cohesion or vice versa, but that they can actually be mutually reinforcing. So I trace these dynamics across time, primarily in two cities, Johannesburg and São Paulo. I've told you about housing today, but when I integrate my findings across the sectors of housing, sanitation, and transportation, I'm able to take this argument in a more global direction. In the book's conclusion, I illustrate this with some other cases that could be useful to see how far this approach to institutional dimensions of distributive politics in cities can travel. So first, you have the rentier city, which I illustrate through the case of Flint, Michigan, in the US. In the late 2000s, private water administration consultants hired by the state received many lucrative contracts to produce reports that denied problems with the water supply that made it unusable for the city's 100,000 residents. On a much larger scale, the informal, deregulated, and captured modes of urban planning in India have been found to be endemic. Second, you have cases of high embeddedness and low cohesion, a mobilizational city. And Washington, D.C., under Marion Barry, and New Delhi, under the Aam Aadmi Party, are cases of movement-oriented regimes in capital cities where national governments undercut municipal power precisely because it's a capital city. So you have low cohesion. Then you have the managerial city, programmatic top-down administration oriented towards growth. The modal growth machine in the US certainly represents this ideal type. But we can also look at Chinese cities, particularly large megacities in the 2000s, that were targeting almost exclusively goals for GDP growth in orienting government action. And then finally, this elusive configuration of high embeddedness and high cohesion. Amsterdam in the 1990s was somewhat famously described by Susan Feinstein as an example of the just city, where strong national investments in housing went to city governments in Amsterdam, driven in large part by the activism of housing movements. Chicago in the 80s is a somewhat incomplete case, but I think most representative from the universe of post-civil rights movement black mayors in the US, where you have investments in urban infrastructure in different neighborhoods in the city, and not only affirmative action in procurement that you see in a number of other post-civil rights movement black mayor-led cities in the US. And the universe of post-civil rights movement black mayors is particularly analogous to the cases that I study in this book, in that you have strong urban mobilizations that produce major democratizing reforms, and then you can evaluate variation at the subnational scale after those reforms. So I want to end with just a couple lessons that this work provides for understanding the relationship of urban governing regimes to inequality. Variation in the coordination of the power to distribute is at the core of how this work contributes to a new global urban social science. First, we can bring institutions back in to how we think about the sources of urban inequalities. And second, we can bring the city back in to how we think about institutional change and the reproduction of inequality. Cities allow us to disaggregate how and why coordination problems of state action are contested. And the city is a fundamentally contested space in which economic inequality is both reproduced and in some rare instances reduced. I've argued today for one set of tools by which to categorize and understand the variation that arises in conflicts over public goods distribution. It's this variation of urban institutions that will go a long way towards shaping the world's urban future. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Ben, and thank you for the book itself that I just received. I had just the PDF, and it's excellent to have the book. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss with you and raise elements. It's an excellent book. I really suggest that people read it. I learned a lot, especially about South Africa, which is a country I know almost nothing, but also about São Paulo, which is my main city of research. So it's a really, really nice reading and very sophisticated academic work. And I obviously agree with most of the central arguments of the book, which are very close and similar and have several connections with my incremental progressivism about the case of São Paulo. So I'm kind of a strange commentator in this case because I'm completely tainted by my own interpretations of the process, which are similar to yours. But I'm going to give you some comments and suggestions to push the model further. And because I think you have a stronger theoretical position than the one that the reader ends the book with. So 3 blocks of elements of different size. But the first one is, I start with a political science discomfort in the claim of unpacking cohesion. I think it's too sociological view of the subject.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah, because in this package, in this concept, you package a lot of things, multi-level processes of capacity building, the construction of policy instruments, bureaucratic politics, government formation, urban politics itself, and all the nuances that are associated with political parties and things like that. So lots of things that, according to political science and the public policy debate, should be unpacked, they are not exactly cohesion, or they have. I think the model, the 2x2 especially, is very strong, but they are not exactly cohesion, and maybe unpacking them could help you find more nuances on the variation of these, and I'm going to return to this in a moment. So it's not just, the idea of cohesion suggests that everything is coordinating capacity, and it's not only coordinating capacity, there's a lot of capacity really here, of the possibility, the tools for doing things, right? So this is the first comment. The second comment, it's a kind of mean comment because this is a comment I have received several times with my book, and I think it applies here, and I think people are right, and this is presented to my argument as a criticism, and I think it fits also here, which is the idea that embeddedness and cohesion are not all also present or similarly present or present not exactly the same way, but with different elements and actors, but it's not also present in right-wing and conservative governments and conservative forces. With different ties, you talk about Elizabeth França, with different ties, different actors to conservative groups, to private companies, and so it's part of the capacity of producing policy, actually. And so maybe you're talking about something broader than the conditions for progressive policy to happen in cities. And I am also maybe talking more of a more general mechanism or group of mechanisms than the production of incremental progressivism. Because conservative governments also have ties with the private sector, with conservative groups, with Catholic groups, and they also mobilize this. And if they want to do or implement their policies, introduce in the agenda, and then implement their policies, they also have to mobilize cohesion and embeddedness. So the mechanism is broader than what you were mentioning here. And this is a criticism I have received. And sometimes you get odd results from the combination of these things. One of your cases, the transportation policy in São Paulo, especially the implementation of the Sistema Integrado, the integrated system, with the MasterCard, had much less to do. It was a left-wing government, but it was the embeddedness was not with social movements. No. The embeddedness was with private companies and the contractors of the bus companies. The linkages between the bus companies and the PT politicians who were running the thing. And at the end, the policy, which is highly redistributive, was implemented. So depending on the policy, I understand that regulating private gain for developers, for example, is something that you cannot do this kind of reasoning. But for providing public services, the real question is what's exactly the design of the policy that, and who pays for what. And depending on the ability of the guys who are running the policy and creating the policy, it's not necessarily a zero-sum game, right? So in this sense, it's not only for right-wing, for left-wing policies and progressive things that reduce inequalities, but it's not only for right-wing policies that. It's everything mixed together, depending on the patterns of relations that are present there. And the third thing, which is, I think, the most important one, is because this one is about pushing the model further. I think you do not explore fully the potential of urban power, the concept. You raise the concept, you define the two elements. I like very much the 2x2 table. Charles Steele said that you are only a comparativist if you have a 2x2 table in your book. So you are a comparativist. And it's great. I like very much the positions of the cases which appeared here, and the students didn't read because it was not in the first, it was in the conclusion. And although it works even better if you think about the governments which are not in the book, after Haddad, and after my book also, the two books stopped with Haddad, because the three administrations are managerial. So São Paulo went down and then went in the same direction that Johannesburg had moved in the first place. So it's nice. It's really nice. And now you mentioned that the Haddad administration was the moment where the thing changed. And I would wonder, and this is just a footnote because this is not really the most important thing for you and for the book, for the argument, the urban argument, if that was not exactly what was the moment in which the mechanism lost ground, lost traction. The mechanism in the sense that the left-wing machine of producing redistributive policies lost ground, lost capacity to produce things. And this is not about only the city of São Paulo or Johannesburg. This has to do with Brazilian politics, the return of the right and the rising of the extreme right, and a certain decline of left-wing political projects from parties, but also movements and unions. And I think this is what we are seeing now at this point. But anyway, this is just a footnote. And I would end saying that, and trying to wrap up this third element that started with the idea that you could have explored more the urban power concept, maybe including other governments at the end, the last three governments, because they enrich your model. I like what you do with other cities. That most of them I have no idea. Actually, I remember you presenting to us at the research group a lot of things about those cities and the mayor of Chicago and the mayor of I don't know where. And it's nice, but I think you should return to the concepts themselves. You should return to urban regimes. And to growth machines, and present your concept in the market of concepts, so to speak, to say, well, this is because you return to historical cases, and you show that the historical cases fit the model, but you don't return to the theoretical models to say that your model incorporates growth machines. We can see growth machines there. We cannot see urban regimes, or we can see a little bit urban regimes because it's in the discussing what power means for you and for Clarence Stone is something. So anyway, there's something there, and this could be a Niger article. So I'm just fishing Niger articles, a wonderful theoretical article for Niger. Thanks a lot.
Do we have questions? Maybe you can
That was a lot.
respond,
Yeah.
quickly respond to the comments, and then we... Oh, there's a question. Sorry. Desculpa.
Hi. Hi, Benjamin. Thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. I'm looking forward to read the book, which I haven't done yet. And my question maybe is something that is expanded on the book, but I was thinking something similar to, I guess, what Edu was commenting on, which is when you relate, for instance, the demobilization that took place in South Africa from the moment that the social movement unionists were more powerful and then they lost traction or something. Can you identify what were the processes or mechanisms through which this demobilization took place? If it's something that was like a counter-insurgence from the right, or if it was, if it has to do with elections? Because I was thinking, and again, I only know so much about like the São Paulo case, but I was thinking of the process that we had here during the revision of the last master plan, which was really undemocratic maneuver that took place. So it was really like a strategy undemocratic strategy to subvert any type of democratic discussion on the master plan. And I was wondering
By
if...
Leite and Nunes.
Yeah, exactly. And I was wondering if you can identify similar strategies to that. You mentioned the districts, and but I wanted to know more if it... Yeah.
Hi, Benjamin. Thank you for your presentation. So just a quick check. So you say social movements, when they are incorporated and become more embedded, they're in fact building state capacity, right? Which in some ways would lead to a new range of policies to be implemented, which would ultimately benefit those social movements. Okay, cool. So I have two related questions. On one hand, is incorporation more mobilization, or is it demobilization? Is incorporation into the state more mobilization, or is it demobilization? Because in some ways, I would sense that becoming incorporated into the state would make movements less radical and would reduce the scope of their demands, right? And on the other hand, how does this relate with new social movements that might emerge? So I'm thinking that in Belo Horizonte, that I know a bit more of, what happens is that older social movements that were claiming rights to housing got in conflict with new occupation movements that wanted to get to land, and they would say, oh, you're a furando fila, right? You're skipping the queue, you're jumping in front of the others. So I wonder, how does this relate with a new, let's say, wave of social movements that would emerge after those that become incorporated into the state? Thank you.
Can I respond? There's so much on the table. Okay, I'm going to respond to Edu, and I'm going to try to go in order here. So, you know, on the one hand, I take the critique that cohesion is doing a lot, and maybe it's doing too much. But I'll also, this is like one of those rare moments where you remind me that you're actually a political scientist and not a sociologist. But I want to maybe defend the concept by describing what I think I'm doing in sociology, because it's something that can seem a little bit obvious in political science, but is not obvious in sociology. So urban sociology is very uninterested in political parties. And one thing that really got me interested in doing research, it was clear that political parties were absolutely central to the story. But the question is, why are political parties central? It's not just as an aggregator of interests in the kind of very traditional representative model that political scientists would use. It's, in particularly, it's what I see in São Paulo under Erundina and Marta. PT is bringing activists into the state. The political party is not precisely important just as an aggregator of interest, but it's because of what it does in that social realm. The party-society linkage is what matters. So that's a sociological view of what parties are doing. In bringing movements into the state, it then can catalyze this process of coordinating capacity. And so that was my interest in deploying the concept of cohesion, was from a sociological perspective to say parties are inside of this concept. And that parties actually play a role in bureaucratic capacity building. And it's not just because of the nomination, the formal nomination process. It's because they're bringing activists into the state through those broader social linkages to parties. Then this question of other types of embeddedness. So I do want to emphasize, and I think in a way this is something that you do too, Edu, the outcome of interest defines the kinds of concepts that you use in some ways. So the outcome of interest is greater inclusion in the distribution of public goods in the city. So there are different kinds of embeddedness. Sure, I mean, Brazil is kind of like a classic example of right-wing embeddedness, not just at the local state. I mean, the Bolsonaro story is a civil society story through and through. What I think is important for thinking about embeddedness at the local level is taking a look at the history and sequence. And the sequence in São Paulo is in my story that I see here, you can't have any of this without the Erundina administration. That is the administration that breaks this barrier and brings housing movements into the bureaucratic sphere. Now, that doesn't mean that subsequent governments won't build on that model, whether they're PT or otherwise. In fact, what you see in the mayoral administrations of Serra and Kasabi is, in fact, many of the institutional lessons learned under Erundina and Marta are institutionalized under Serra and Kasabi. And so, yeah, the PT-linked movements hate Betsy França. But she's talking with them and she's talking with other movements. Mm-hmm. But it's the spaces of the city that are made visible through that movement organization that drive how she conceives of her work in her department to deliver sanitation to places that didn't have it previously. Perhaps the precise places that she focused on were a bit more driven by her linkages compared to the linkages that PT administrations have. But the institutionalized modus operandi of what is a policy priority is shaped through that history. Certainly, I mean, the bus story is a fascinating story, and that's not about movements, but it's about these broader activist linkages. I mean, this is about Tatolandia, and it's not. It's very informal, but it's not always about like organized social movements in the way we think about movements in the housing sphere in São Paulo. I have to think about this paper idea, urban power in light of. I mean, I do think that this is what I'm proposing here is what I think is a more capacious concept, that urban regimes, in many, as it was articulated by Stone, it's quite close to growth machines in a lot of ways. This is a long-standing critique that exists, and I agree with it, that it kind of assumes that real estate capital and political elites are going to be in tight alliance. And that goes back to the embeddedness question. I assume that is the default. Embeddedness is when you get beyond that default and you develop some kind of countervailing power in local government that isn't just pursuing economic growth, but has distributive goals as a major part of its orientation. All right, I want to come to the movement questions, and maybe this will lead me back to why did the left-wing machine lose its redistributive emphasis? So, in the story in South Africa, the ANC, unlike the PT, has a much more kind of Leninist, vanguardist ideological orientation. And I mean, somewhat like the PT, there are multiple tendencies within the ANC. But at the moment of the first democratic elections, it was this vanguardist orientation that won out quite strongly within the ANC. And so there was a decision explicitly taken to demobilize the UDF, that it should shift into being a body that's called the South African National Civics Organization that would be subsumed within the ANC as opposed to an external partner of the ANC. And so in many ways, that's about party ideology. Then this question of, is incorporation into the state mobilization or demobilization? I don't play the game that you sometimes see in social movement studies where it's like valorizing one movement over another. What I'm interested in here is about the history and sequence of movements. So my assumption, and this is well documented in the literature on movements, that movements start out more radical, they get incorporated, they get defanged, they lose their strength, they become bureaucratized. What I think is striking in São Paulo is you have multiple generations of movements that have gone through that. And each time that cycle happens, there's another movement that's organized at the citywide scale, that's oriented towards programmatic policy demands. What happened in Johannesburg is you had those movements, and now it's much more fragmented. So the kinds of, Johannesburg, the rate of protest in Johannesburg is sometimes described as the highest rate of protest anywhere in the world. So this is not a place where there are no movements. All of these movements are constituted at the neighborhood level or even the street level. You don't get policy demands coming from these movements. These are demands for specific benefits to their street or their neighborhood. You have a long history of multiple generations of movements. In São Paulo, you can think of the UMM to the FELM to the MTST. Each generation of these movements has been focused on making wide-ranging policy demands that shape governing structures. And so that's why the question of like mobilization or demobilization, I actually assume demobilization, but then you have multiple generations that keep coming afterwards. Now, with Haddad, I know this is like his former institution, so maybe he's still employed here. Okay.
He's still a professor here.
Okay. When I interviewed him, he was quite explicit about what I interviewed him. Some of you all may remember there was an article that he wrote in Piauí. It was like Vivi na Pele, something like that. And I interviewed him like days in the same week that article came out. So he was in a reflective and combative mood. And he described to me the point that he was trying to get at when he ran for mayor the first time. He said to me, I wanted it to be a socio-environmental coalition. And then he went on to describe in sociological terms what that meant to him. He said, this is going to be about uniting the middle-class cyclists movements, and he described other kind of like bourgeois environmental movements with a kind of urbanist view of the city. And he had brought in a different set of planning professionals who had not been part of prior PT administrations to really drive his urban planning priorities. And so this, from the outset, he came in with a much more managerial view of what he should be doing in government. And, the multiple movements described to me a sense of betrayal with Haddad, that for the first time, the housing secretary, which was always the key point of contact for housing movements in local government, this was part of the coalition agreement. It was a PP person who was made the housing secretary. So I think it's those early kind of moves which actually have some resonances with the kind of story that I'm telling about Johannesburg that help shape this move backwards in terms of from high embeddedness to low embeddedness.
We have two questions from the YouTube chat. Both of them from Carolina Requena. First, I'm wondering if the idea of coalition instead of regime could help you account for most of the local SP governments, which were, after all, right-wing and not allied to social movements. That's the first question. And the second question is, did you look at compared policy results beyond government regimes to understand how much an integrationist regime would be delivering more or better public housing compared to the other regimes? Do we have questions from the audience? Maybe we can collect.
I didn't understand that last question.
The last question is, if you compare policy results and not just government regimes to understand how much an integrationist regime would be delivering more or better public housing compared to the other regimes. So I guess that the product, the result of this.
So in a way, both of these questions get at how durable are any of these categories. I think that if you look at the construction of policy in São Paulo, you have something that's durable enough that across time that suggests something that approximates a regime and not just a kind of momentary coalition. I should also say I didn't do, this is where I see my work as quite complementary to what Edu did in the incremental progressivism book, because Edu was looking at policy, the construction of policy. And what I start with is hard outcomes in the ground. And then try to go back from that to see, well, what's the relationship of policy to hard outcomes in the ground? But the one problem that presents is I think it's unrealistic to expect the outcomes to be measurable at such a fine grain that you can apply them to each mayoral administration. I mean, there is this kind of, I find this kind of amusing thing that happens in Brazil where when it comes election time and people are running for re-election, they'll do these like balanços do governo and then like all these numbers will be shown on some sheet, and like you look at these products and you're not really sure like what story you should really get from these balanços do governo, because they're political documents ultimately. And the way that we measure hard outcomes just it doesn't happen at such a fine grain that you can really apply them to each mayoral administration. So I was wary of making claims at that fine grain about hard outcomes, but you can do it much more easily with policies.
Any remaining questions, comments? Yeah.
First, thank you for the presentation. And I don't know if that goes beyond the scope of the book, because you said it goes all the way to 2016. But I wanted to know your assertions about the period that they've been going through ever since 2016. Because you mentioned the level of embeddedness kind of derailed after Haddad's term as a mayor. And we are currently in our third term with a more right-leaning government, but there are still some actions and cooperation with the social housing movements. For example, there have been buildings that have been expropriated and then retrofitted for social housing with participation from these movements that had been previously occupying it. But there's also, I also wanted to know your assertions considering the political side of it, because we haven't had a left-leaning government ever since, but we have new political factors. For example, the main candidate on the left for the previous two elections, first, he isn't from the Workers' Party, and second, he is from the housing movement. So I wanted to know your assertions regarding it. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to say anything too definitive because I haven't I just read the news. But I mean, the the continued kind of housing expropriations that you alluded to, I think that's really quite fascinating. Perhaps even more telling is the resurgence and persistence of the demand for tarifa zero with the buses. And the way that by the time you got to this most recent election, before the campaign even started, everybody agreed that they were going to support tarifa zero. Now, as far as I know, Nunes has not implemented tarifa zero, but I think there are like more exceptions and things that have been introduced. And maybe on Sundays it's, yeah.
Sundays, yes.
So all of that suggests certainly some kind of social power that's behind it. It also suggests, it's very suggestive of the incremental progressivism argument that there's not just long afterlives of progressive policies, but actually that they're quite present and live. Now the Bolus story, it's also kind of, it's a bit hard to interpret from the outside. You know, if he had won, it would be this great story that we could say like, look, housing movements actually determine politics in Sao Paulo, but it's not exactly that, because he didn't do any better this time than he did the last time. In fact, he looks weaker as a result of the way that last election went. You know, I don't know what his relationship is with the MIT-SIT right now. So I have a lot of questions. I'd like to know more about that. But I think the outcomes suggest a bit of a mixed story on the Bolus front.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for the presentation. It's really interesting to listen to you presenting after reading, because I think it complements what we get from the book. And one point that got me from your presentation is you mentioned explicitly Erundina. Mm-hmm. So she's a key political actor that kind of inaugurated a new trajectory. And she launched a new model with like high embeddedness and high cohesion. Mm-hmm. And when you mentioned the effort, South African case, if I got well, you said that I think Mandela kind of told the movements to demobilize, I mean, the political elites. And when you were talking about Haddad, you were also mentioning that he had a political agenda that didn't prioritize the social movements. Mm-hmm. So I have two questions connected to this reflection. So the first one is, what's the role of politicians? Mm-hmm. Because they are not in your model, and from your words, they are relevant. So I get that they are relevant because they launch new trajectories, but is this it? How they do it? Mm-hmm. I mean, what do you think? Where are them in the model? Yeah. And the other question is, you kind of presented, if I got it well, like that there is path dependence. Mm-hmm. Because when when there is high embeddedness and high cohesion, this kind of, in the São Paulo case, it remained independent of the political party. And I think it's the sentence by Beth França shows this. She's like, okay, they're relevant, I don't want, but I have to talk to them because they are putting like political pressure. And my question is, what causes changes, for example? So is the São Paulo case now completely different? Is there like a cause? I mean, was this path dependence in São Paulo interrupted, or is this still going on? I mean, many questions.
Mm-hmm. So what is the role of politicians? There's another reason why Erundina is important for answering this question, which is what she represented within the PT at the time that she was elected, which is, and in part, it helps explain why Sao Paulo avoided the same fate of Johannesburg. Erundina was not the chosen candidate of Lula. It was a whole kind of like insurgent campaign in the primaries, which I describe in the book when I met with Amir Kair, who was the finance secretary for Erundina and was very involved in this insurgent campaign in the primary. He still had the news clipping from when they won that primary behind his desk, which suggested to me how important this was for understanding what they were trying to do. Part of that insurgency was to say, we are actually located in the peripheries, and we want to bring the movements in the peripheries, particularly the Zona Leste, into the state. And so, this isn't, I don't have a view on the individual attributes, kind of like leadership psychology kind of thing. But what mattered about Erundina was not just what she was doing when she was in government, but was how she reconfigured the political moment within the PT to bring movements into government afterwards. And that's something, there was no moment like that in the ANC. It was a much more structured and top-down way of bringing politicians into the state, such that they were always looking upwards instead of trying to generate social power from below to win their position. And then how deep is the path dependence? That's a tough one. And there's always this problem of infinite regress with path dependence and everything. I stopped the study in 2016, well, in part because I got quite nervous about what was happening in Brazil. And, because like when I arrived here, I think Dilma had just been impeached. But it also, I think that decision was a sound one, notwithstanding the fact that there are some key dimensions that continue on from the story today, which is that the funding of municipal governments came under major strain once Temer came into power. It was both a political story and a macroeconomic story. In South Africa, it was also a moment where it was the first coalition government in Johannesburg, and so it seemed like that was a very different kind of political climate. So I don't have a strong view about path dependence beyond the period of study. But, this discussion today certainly gives some indications that there's at least some degree of path dependence, which I think, helps to sustain the model. So that's great.
I don't see any. Yeah. Thank you very much, Ben, for your outstanding presentation. Obrigado a todas e todas pela presença aqui, para quem nos acompanha pelo YouTube. Eu não agradeci no começo, me desculpem a Sérgio por organizar esse seminário. Obrigado, gente.
So now I have to submit a paper to you.
Yes, you should. Actually, you could just do a paper on the book.
How does that work?
Nice.
What do you mean a paper on the book?
With the presentation
Oh,
of the urban power.
Oh, yeah, yeah.